Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Star Theater. And for those of you that are watching from your stateroom televisions, welcome to you also. We're delighted that you could join us for the first of our many presentations brought to you by our enrichment team, which has been very thoughtfully curated by our home team. And I have to say, you're in for a real treat on this voyage because every single one of our speakers has a wonderful assortment of topics to cover that will certainly enlighten and enrich your experience. I'm particularly proud to introduce you to our Viking resident historian for the first of many talks that he'll have during this itinerary. Would you please give a warm Viking welcome to Alexander Bunzel?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm grateful for that warm welcome and delighted that your Viking welcome didn't involve raiding the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a privilege to be back on board Viking, and I would delight in any questions you have at the end, outside the Star Theatre, of course. And also, if you'd like to come up to me during the cruise, it would be a pleasure to, discuss anything you wish. Today, we're looking at a particularly interesting piece of history. It's something which probably many of us wouldn't have thought was possible in an earlier time. Right now, let's start with the Carta Mariner, the first known map of the Nordic countries. This is an incredible map which was put together by one Olaus Magnus. Now, he was an ecclesiastic who was living in the year 1539 when he put this together. And what it shows is various countries from the organization that we're going to be discussing tonight. So, what was the Hanseatic League? Well, Hansa means guild or association. It's a word that endures today in German for those of you who have flown Lufthansa. And it may have derived from the earlier word for troop or company. We'll use the words Hanseatic League and Hansa interchangeably. The League emerged in the mid-12th century, becoming more organized from the 14th century. So you can see that gradual evolution. From the year 1350, it began to operate as a protectionist cartel, limiting its rivals. It forbade its members from entering into business associations with non-Hansa members, yet it did not guarantee free trade. The lecture tonight is going to consider 4 questions. What was Europe like prior to the 15th century? What framework underpinned Hanseatic trade? How did the Hanseatic traders live day to day? And finally, what caused the League's decline? So let's set the stage. The Hanseatic League, as I've described it, was an alliance of trading guilds. It would span Northern Europe as well as the Baltic states, but it mainly contained German states. It's thought to have had around 90 to 100 members, but there were many smaller states, and if we count them as well, it may have had 200 at its peak. Quite a leap, I hear you thinking, but you must remember that some of these countries drifted in and out of Hanseatic membership. From time to time, they had their own exit, and that had ramifications for the League. It became to dominance prior to the voyage of Europeans to the New World, and that's something we're going to come to when we begin to look at the voyages of Columbus and his contemporaries, and the kind of challenges that posed to the League. What it did was standardized trading regulations in a way much like organizations we have today, be it the European Union or the World Trade Center. The World Trade Organization, I should say. But that's quite interesting because historians don't always like analogy, and they like to say that today we have very different polities in place. If you look at what the League was doing, it was about member states coming together to monopolize and benefit from their shared interests. That has striking parallels with today. And of course, many of the Hanseatics believed that by cooperating and trading, they could prevent war. Now, they weren't always successful, but that underlying belief is something which connects past and present. So how did it come about? Well, the League started in Northern Europe, spreading across all the countries that you can see here on the screen at the top. It would encompass such faraway places as London, Bruges, and even Novgorod in Russia. So there were many different languages and cultures at play in the League, which again is a remarkable feat when you consider that they made it work. The German Hanseatics would colonize the towns that would grow into cities, such as Riga, Danzig, and Dorpat. And you can see in the case of Danzig, for example, how it's very important that these places have a port in order for them to fully participate in League membership. In doing so, the German Hanseatics are laying the foundations for an organisation spanning 400 years. Now, how do they make this work? Well, I spoke to you a moment ago about the different languages, didn't I? The Hanseatic traders spoke Middle Low German as a common language. Now, I'm not going to ask if we have any Middle Low German speakers in the audience, because German, as we know it today, evolved slightly differently. But this grew into the kind of languages which you now find spoken in northern Germany, as well as across Scandinavia. It's important that they have this common language because they don't, for example, have currency exchanges or language translators. In fact, much of the trade took place in a barter system, and they'd keep ledgers, generation to generation, family to family. And that was how they made this work so successfully. It meant that even in times of hardship, you could be relying on the other Hanseatic traders to provide you with food, and knowing that you or your descendants would pay them back. So an incredibly intelligent system for a time where hardship and destitution existed. The League did have common administrative systems. What do these include? Well, there was a fragmented military, a tariff system, a governing body called the Hanseatic, which met every 3 years. It's almost beginning to sound like an Australian parliament. The system lasted from 1356 to around 1669. And in addition to the shared institutions I've already described, there were much more day-to-day ones, such as warehouses, chapels, taverns, places where people could come together to trade, but also to build strong personal business ties. They worked through consensus, and many of the meetings that they had would be held in Lübeck in particular. So I want to set the stage by considering the kind of organizations that were around at the time, and also the experiences Hanseatic traders, among other Europeans, would have gone through. Just one moment. There we go. So, the Holy Roman Empire, to refer to one of my favourite quotes in history from Jean-Marie or Voltaire, was neither holy nor Roman, nor was it an empire. It really is one of the enigmas of history, because most of us will have encountered it in passing, but it doesn't have any of the bearing that Britain or Spain or Italy or the Italian principalities appear to have had. And maybe by the end of this segment you'll understand why. The Holy Roman Empire managed to last 1,000 years, the 9th to the 19th centuries AD, and in doing so it endured twice as long as the Imperial Roman era. But it was more of a loose configuration, a decentralized body, perhaps showing how decentralization, for all its shortcomings, is a system which can work to ensure perpetuity. The Holy Roman Empire included much of modern-day Germany. It included 10 parts of 10 other countries, ranging from Denmark to Italy. And you're looking at a map of the empire here, right in the middle there in orange, you're looking at it at its height, the 13th century. So who founded the Holy Roman Empire? Well, it was none other than Charlemagne in the year 800 AD. It became insignificant over time as its member states grew more powerful and organized. Now, the empire lacked many of the features that typically define a country, such as a capital or centralized institutions. It didn't even have a sense of nationhood. Do we have any fans in the audience of US President James Madison? Anyone here? I'm seeing a few raised hands. Now, Madison, being the flatterer that he was, described the Holy Roman Empire as a nerveless body, incapable of regulating its own members, insecure against external dangers, and agitated with unceasing fermentations in its own bowels. The empire was dissolved in 1806 after Napoleon defeated it at Austerlitz, and Emperor Francis II abdicated, releasing the member states from their obligations. So you can see that even though the organization, the state if you will, lasted so many years, it wasn't able to face up to such a threat as Napoleon. It didn't have the systems in place to hold him at bay. And Napoleon reorganized the empire into the Confederation of the Rhine. What's interesting is that the nature of this confederation kept much of its shape, with the German Confederation coming into being in 1815. And I'm looking forward next week to discussing the history of Germany with you and building on what we've spoken about tonight. So, how did this network of peoples, languages, and cultures last so long? Well, it was a coalition in an era preceding the rise of the nation-state. And this brings us to the Hanseatic traders, who, in their own right, were able to fill a vacuum. But the other, much darker element of this period of history was one of plague. The Black Death devastated Europe, wiping out, well, let's guess what proportion of Europeans it wiped out. Do I have any bidders? What proportion? What percentage? A third? Do I hear a third? Do I hear 50%? I hear 50% to the man in the middle. Do I hear anything higher? 100. Okay. I mean, if it had wiped out 100% of Europeans, we'd all be speaking Russian. Oh, never mind. Too soon. But no, it killed 60% of Europeans, regardless of age, gender, or class. And there are two impacts of this. One, hooray for the workers that survived, massive wage rises, but also shortages, because there were people who weren't there to produce goods that had been produced. It was devastating. And one of the changes it led to was the abandonment of serfdom. It meant that Scandinavia took 100 years to recover its population. Norway, in fact, took 400 years, and it never recovered its nobility. The plague is relevant for the League in two respects. One, it came about due to the growth of ships. You all know the story of the dangerous plague-carrying insects, which were on the rats, which came with the ships. Ports in Crimea, Constantinople, Alexandria, Tunis, they all became linked with southern European ports, like Venice and Genoa. And Venice would go on, as a result of its dominance, to hold huge economic and political power in Europe. But why does this relate to the League? Well, it underscores how these countries became linked through trade and through ships. They needed to cooperate in such a time. Secondly, plague coincided with Europe's increasing population density in the 11th to the 13th century, and that too included Hanseatic cities. As modern seafarers, enjoying the comforts of tea and scones at 5 p.m, we can sometimes forget how dangerous the open sea seemed. European fishermen and mariners would wear amulets for luck. They believed there were giant sea monsters lurking below their vessels. And you can see one here on screen, the whale from the year 1511. And it represents the superstitions they had, but also the apprehension of some people to go to sea as a result. I'm assured by Bruce that there are no such sea creatures lurking below the Viking sky. Now, seafarers had limited tools to ensure their direction. Weather forecasting was something that would only come about gradually. In the year 1650, you've got the Babylonians predicting weather based on the clouds. That's 650 BC. Then the Chinese, ever amazing innovators, in the year 300 BC were developing a calendar with festivals, so they're beginning to chart the weather as well. But it's only during the Renaissance, and particularly the latter part of Hanseatic history, that weather instruments would be invented, like the hygrometer, which would measure humidity from the mid-15th century. Galileo came up with the thermometer in the year 1593, and the barometer emerged in 1643. Finally, Fahrenheit's thermometer came about in 1714. So you do see incremental progress from the early modern through to the modern period, but you can understand that Hanseatic traders, for their part, were at the mercy of chance when sailing between ports. I've projected a very positive impression of the League so far, but it was not always united. There was no common Hanseatic flag until the 16th century. Some members would move in and out of the League, as I've described. In fact, the English were notorious. They were sometimes called non-Hansa in the sources. Hopefully this is not a reputation that we will retain in the modern day as non-Hansa. The naval battles themselves could be brutal. They would be focusing on killing rather than taking captives. They would involve crossbows, daggers, cannons, and guns also would be used at sea in 1384. In fact, all the Hanseatic cities would have guns by the 15th century. Now this shows us how quickly the new technologies could proliferate, ladies and gentlemen. You see, the early guns were unreliable, and the gunpowder was expensive. But once the designs improved with innovation, they were able to become widespread. Other important technology included the Baltic cog. Now, the Baltic cog was a vessel which allowed the merchants using it to have an advantage on account of its speed, its reliability. Given the conflicts I've described, how strong really were the Hanseatic relationships? Well, German cities like Lübeck built maritime trading relationships with faraway cities by the North Sea, as well as the Baltic. And this occurred because the German cities wanted the goods that were on offer. They wanted the waxes, the resins, the furs, the rye, the wheat. So you can see the advantages that trade had to offer. Lübeck's role in the fishing trade meant that it needed to preserve the fish. It needed salt. So from 1241, Lübeck would become more cooperative with Hamburg, which had dominated the salt trade. Again, it's about mutual interests rather than because these states like each other. And over 75 years, the League would become more structured, involving a greater number of trading partners, as well as finding ways to reduce trading barriers. One example is a charter from King Henry III. He granted it to the Lübeck-Hamburg alliance in the year 1266, and that's what led to the creation of a Hanseatic trading post in London. So those of you who have been to Cannon Street Station, well, that was originally the London contour. And we're going to come on to the contours in a short while. Towards the 14th century, each German town was promoting its own trade. There was ever greater competition, and you start to see the emergence of such things as flags, for the members of the League. But eventually they also develop a common red flag for the League members, which is ironic because if you're studying the history of Caribbean pirates, you'll find that they were using a bloody red flag themselves, so a popular colour. It was not guaranteed that the Hanseatics would become traders necessarily. Consider the Vikings, who were uninvolved in trade in the 9th and 10th centuries. So that demonstrates how lucky they were to make this work. Now we've discussed how luck played its part, but from the 14th century onwards, or actually more like towards the end of the 14th, so early 15th century, traders were being assisted by the Book of the Sea, and this was something that they used to gain directions for navigating the terrain and avoiding any dangerous islands. It would include such details as lighthouses and harbours, tides, cliffs, rock projections. So this shows us how mankind evolved by passing on knowledge one generation to the next through books. So let's look at some of the Hanseatic trade itself. The League never had the structure of a federation, and it wasn't a corporation like the Dutch East India Company, founded in the year 1602. Despite its vast trading corridor, in fact, it had no governing body. It elected officials. It didn't have elected officials. It didn't have a navy or central coffers either. On the one hand, it's notable that it succeeded for so many years without these institutions. On the other hand, as I suggested earlier, perhaps it is that lack of central governance which allowed the League to last so long. After all, it shows the importance of competition, incentives, and an informal cooperative system. What held the League together, principally, was a belief in the importance of open waters, a way of using money to monopolize the Baltic. Now, we've already spoken about the number of League members. I've suggested 90 to 100, but up to 200 with the smaller members. Why would any of these states join in the first place? Well, people both feared and respected the League. It could offer bribes, it could offer loans. Equally, it could deny you a loan. It could impose a trade embargo. So much the same way today that countries want to join an organisation, you can see how there was pressure to be part of it once it existed. On screen, you can see a number of the different goods that were traded. Many of them were staples for food, warmth, and building materials. But Europeans also traded luxury materials from the 13th century. Furs such as sable, ermine and fox, English wool, Prussian grains, Scandinavian herring and cod. You can see the range of delicacies and why it would have been attractive to buy from a Hanseatic trader rather than from your local Whole Foods or the equivalent. Now, it became possible over time to produce high quality textiles, and that's one of the ways again in which the League distinguishes itself. The League would raise northern Germany's standard for foodstuffs and for the creation of goods, allowing people to prosper more than the rural areas that were cut off from trade. And so you remember we spoke about how the people who benefited and the places that benefited tended to be close to the sea. By improving lifestyles, the League demonstrates the human benefit from fostering trade. In fact, the League also became involved in the art trade, which is something we're going to come on to. It would bring the art from the Low Countries through to Scandinavia as well as the Baltic. The Baltic cog is something I mentioned earlier, something that would expand trade from the 14th century. So how did it succeed? Well, first of all, it increases the boat's capacity to about 10 times as much cargo, as the earlier Viking ships were transporting. You can see an illustration here on the upper right, which shows how the ship's design would vary and evolve. It varied between the different cities, and that competition, again, is something which allows the League to develop. Across the different ships, however, the Baltic cog would have common features. Relatively flat bottoms. It would have linseed oil over the sides, which would help which would help along with the resin to keep it in place. And it had tar, which was used to caulk the ship. You didn't want any water getting in. And then there would be a stern rudder too. The Baltic cog tended to sail in fleets, so that's providing safety in numbers. You see then how the Hanseatic traders are not only developing their technology, but also their strategy for how the way in which they go about their business. So how do we know so much about the Baltic cog? Well, for one thing, we've got the medieval sketches, as you can see. We've got the prints as well. But perhaps most importantly, we have a model. We have a Baltic cog from 1380, found in the 1960s. And this is on display in the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. The Baltic cog was also supported by other Hanseatic advances, the creation of lighthouses among the League members, the effort to teach workers to navigate and to ensure the safe passage of vessels. So again, it's not just the technology, it's the strategy, and it's the systems they have in place that allow them to maintain that edge. Let's look at the vessels a little bit more closely and see how they functioned. Initially, a Hanseatic vessel would have a crew of 18 to 25 men and perhaps 5 to 20 passengers. This grew over time, with a Baltic cog eventually requiring 100 crew members. It was necessary to resist the threat of piracy. How fast would a Baltic cog go? Well, do we have any guesses about the average speed of a cruise ship today in knots? Any guesses? 22, almost spot on. This person is particularly speedy, I see. 20 knots is the average speed. And a Baltic cog probably travelled at about 4 or 5 knots. So we're totally outcompeting them today. But to travel from Lübeck to Tallinn, Estonia, is something that would have taken them about 6 days. So still a very impressive feat. And that shows that speed was important, but perhaps not the primary goal in its design. I've already spoken to you about the importance of the Hanseatic flags. You can see the red flag on display here. And it's important because Allied members might see a ship in danger, look to its flag and decide to help it. In addition to fighting the pirates, the Hanseatic cities fought each other. There are 3 examples from the 15th century. The Dano-Hanseatic War, the Dutch Hanseatic War, and even the Anglo-Hanseatic War. And we're going to get into some of these a bit more in my lecture on Scandinavian history on Thursday night at 6:30 p.m, when I tell you about the Kalmar Union involving Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which fought in the Dano-Hanseatic War. You can see how people went to war over trade. People would die to preserve their city's commercial advantages. But now we get to the most exciting segment of the lecture, looking at the contours. There were 4 contours: London, Bruges, Bergen, and Novgorod. Technically, these weren't League members. You might think of a contour as a city within a city. It would have walls, or it would be a fort. It would be segregated in some way. Novgorod's contour, also known as Peterhof, would even have its own church. So why were the contours useful? They were something of a home away from home for the Hanseatic traders. They would offer commercial privileges, and I spoke to you earlier about how trade would pass from generation to generation. So if you knew the person in the contour or the family, That could be a reliable part of your business structure. They provided a sense of security, and in the context of multiple languages and cultures, that's a really important community. So let's look at Novgorod in particular. In the 14th century, it was one of Europe's largest cities, using the trade of pelts as well as silver ingots and grains to drive daily commerce. But the Kontor's future would wane when Moscow conquered Novgorod in 1478, pushing out the Germans. It wasn't the last time Russians pushed out Germans. Now, Ivan the Great closed the Kontor in the year 1494, and although it would go on to resume its role in trading in the year 1540, it had lost some of its opportunity. I suppose that break in its continuity shook its dominance over trade, and it was never the same. It goes to show how prosperity is not guaranteed, and we'll see a few more examples of that later. Let's turn to the third segment of the lecture. Just a quick check on time. We're doing well. Third segment of the lecture, daily life in the Hanseatic League. So, I mentioned there was a Kontor in London in the years between the 15th and 16th centuries. And you're looking here at a Hanseatic trader by none other than Hans Holbein the Younger. This is, of course, the famous European artist who goes on to paint King Henry VIII. What was life like in this particular Kontor? Well, it's known as the Steel Yard, and the merchants who were interested in cloth making tended to go there, and they lived there for many a year. But ultimately, the Great Fire of London, 1666, caused the Kontor to burn down. And that's why Cannon Street Station, as I say, occupies it today. For those who lived there while it was established, people tended to be young. They would go to the same church and taverns. They even had contact with the local woman. However, it was forbidden to fight, to gamble, and to climb trees. You can't have everything, ladies and gentlemen. Another means to understand the Hanseatic life is through art. We always think of history, don't we, in terms of written sources, but these material sources can lend a wealth of information. So Holbein is someone who painted these pictures, and that was because his commissions for religious art had dried up in a time where Europe was departing from fine art. And so he had a letter from a rather good referee, I think you'll agree, Erasmus. And he took that letter to the court of Henry VIII, where Sir Thomas More recognised him on account of this letter and gave him more commissions. We don't really have time to go through each individual here, but I wanted to look at the materials, look at where they're sitting in front of their desks, and the importance that places on their station. What can we learn from Bergen's Kontor? Well, Bergen was small and remote. It wasn't cosmopolitan like London. And that meant that the Hanseatics had more influence over the local authorities. It has the best preserved Kontor, as you'll have seen, a UNESCO heritage site. But the Bergen Hanseatic Museum is closed for restoration, so maybe it's one to see on your next visit. It was important. During the 12th century, Denmark imported Bergen's fish. Now, I found this astonishing when I learned this fact, but salted fish has a 10-year lifespan. So you can see how it was an invaluable resource for enduring through hard times. England, in turn, would supply most of Bergen's grain, which made sense when less than 3% of Norway is arable. Germans would arrive in the 13th century, and by the year 1259, many decided to stay. But the Black Death arriving in 1360, as I say, killed off a great many people. It's also true that the German traders in Bergen faced limitations. They could only trade directly in Norwegian towns and markets. Business north of Bergen had to be handled through the contour. So again, you see the importance of the contour in underscoring trade. What was it like to be a Hanseatic trader living in Bergen? Well, again, it's a male-oriented society. 1,000 men, generally unmarried, and unlike the English, they were not allowed to have contact with local women. It was forbidden. There was a hierarchy in Hanseatic society in Bergen. Apprentices, and then they became journeymen, and finally the lucky one would become a foreman, or in turn the manager. The manager wouldn't typically be the owner. The owner wouldn't live there. But it had a brutal lifestyle in some ways. I mean, when they would arrive as apprentices, they'd be given food and beer, and then they'd be beaten. That was called the water game. The castle game would involve them getting drunk and being beaten before a feast. I mean, it doesn't feel like a very fun game to me. maybe more so for the people already there. The reality is, on the one hand, this suggests that the Hanseatics are trying to train up the apprentices to be tough, to endure life in the contour. On the other hand, it makes life sound pretty miserable and suggests that violence was one of the outlets for those already there. What about business in the contour? Well, I've told you that it was based on barter and account books. Bergen's merchants would maintain their ties with the German buyers, and that was something that would discourage them from seeking out competition. Another feature of daily life was religion. So here we'll get to religion in a moment, but here you can see the kind of living quarters that the Hanseatic traders would have occupied. Religion's important because the Germans owned two churches, St. Mary's in Bryggen, which is still around. The other church burned down in the year 1702. And again, with the destruction of these churches, like the destruction of the London contour, you see how we can't take for granted material history remaining with us. The German Hanseatics would be living in the kind of conditions that you see here, but it was overall designed to be a home away from home, a place they'd feel comfortable settling in. I want to look now at the Hanseatic city of Gdansk. The Polish settled Gdansk in the 10th century. It flourished under the Kingdom of Poland, and it's a place which is really known for its grain, becoming one of the largest Hanseatic cities. Some of the emblems survive, and you can see the crane gate, for example, here in the middle. This alludes to the very cranes that would be used for hoisting up cargo. So there's a lot of symbolism, and clearly the Hanseatics were a proud group of people. It was also in some ways a welcome to the foreigners who would come to Gdansk and come to trade there. It's a way of showing the city's opulence. Gdansk is also the birthplace of Fahrenheit, whose house is on the right, and we've already mentioned his invention in 1714. Now, we've spoken about piracy throughout the lecture alongside trade. In some ways, it's the yin and yang. You can see the people who are working to build lasting ties and the people who are trying to disrupt them. The impact of piracy is clear from this triptych. It was commissioned in the 15th century for a Florentine chapel. I can tell you it never made it. Hanseatic pirates stole this painting en route from London to Pisa during the Anglo-Hanseatic War. It was taken to Gdansk, and it's remained there for 500 years. Do we have any lawyers in the room? Oh, they don't want to admit it, do they? Well, it's interesting to me because I don't think they're still in time for bringing a legal action to recover it, but it might be worth trying in your retirement. Let's now turn to the final segment of the lecture. You have the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, so why not the rise and fall of the Hanseatic League. I've told you about how it peaked in the 15th century. So what were the three factors that affected its prosperity? Well, firstly, the League became less relevant due to an era of nation building and alliances. You had Lithuania and Poland having joined forces, Denmark, Sweden and Norway having formed the Kalmar Union. The German states, established in the year 1648 after the Peace of Westphalia, grew powerful. And so did the Dutch, using the Dutch East India Company as a means to enhance their wealth from 1602. So overall, the rise of these nation states is bringing security, and that makes the Hanseatic League less necessary. Secondly, Novgorod's contour was closed. We've spoken about the work of Ivan the Great and how Russia would focus on Asia for the next 2 centuries before Peter the Great looked west in the 18th century. Thirdly, Italy would develop business credit and bookkeeping during the Renaissance. This was the time of the Medicis, ladies and gentlemen, using their banking interests to further their wealth. Silver coins became an alternative to the Hanseatic barter exchange system. So altogether, the League was overtaken by new priorities as well as approaches to business, rather than due to its own failures. It didn't end because it suffered badly. It ended because it no longer worked as well compared to all the other systems that were developing. But all of this, ladies and gentlemen, has been a very Eurocentric view of the League. The reality is also the shifting trade patterns. While the Hanseatic League was grappling with challenges, Western Europeans were looking overseas. You had Prince Henry the Navigator in the 15th century sponsoring the kind of vessels in Portugal that would go south down the coast of Africa. You had Christopher Columbus seeking the maritime passage to the Far East, discovering the New World, spices, wealth, tea and porcelain. And this is an age of discovery which continues in the 1490s with Vasco da Gama sailing around the Cape of Good Hope and going to India, while the Portuguese would establish colonies in Goa and Macau. In the end, Hanseatic trade was offering fewer opportunities than those that were available at the same time. It's the same reason why you see Venice struggling in due course as European trade becomes more transatlantic trade. What had worked as a local model now had to compete with wider trade routes and new destinations offering other opportunities. We've only got one more topic to consider before we wrap up, and that's the impact of the Protestant Reformation. This began in the year 1517 when Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses. I made a joke the other day at court. I don't know if any of you will find it funny, but we were talking about whether or not a claim had been served on the other side, and someone said that it had been nailed to the door, and I said, well, it worked for Martin Luther. Anyway, the impact of Martin Luther is that Fish Fridays became less common. No, really. The Pope had decreed that people should eat fish on a Friday, and with the rise of Protestantism, that became less of an urgent doctrine. So there's less demand for fish, and therefore less demand for the Hanseatic traders. In summary, what is the League's legacy? Well, after Bismarck united Germany in 1871, Kaiser Wilhelm II sought guidance from earlier history, and the story of the Hanseatics was one which inspired him to broaden Germany's reach in Europe and globally. Of course, it didn't end very well for Kaiser Wilhelm. But the Hanseatics has shown him the advantages of having naval fleets and colonial outposts. We've also explored the spirit of cooperation that existed in the League. Hanseatic countries had common interests in forging systems in order to combat piracy and facilitate exchange. This shows the benefits of a system of loose cooperation, which is flexible and allows for competition. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, the League is a reminder of the importance of innovation. Its furs and salt fish did not decline in quality. Instead, consumers found new markets and trade routes they preferred. What had been a reliable system of cooperation for centuries became less relevant as new markets opened up. Today, wherever we're from, we think we know who our trading partners and rivals are. We think we understand the best ways of doing business and which technologies to use. The Hanseatic League demonstrates how a system that has worked for centuries can dissolve if it doesn't remain competitive. Its decline reminds us of the need to innovate. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to seeing you Thursday evening here at 6:30, History of Scandinavia. Thank you very much.